Welcome to Doing the Work, Frontline Stories of Social Change, where we bring you stories of real people working to address real issues. I am your host, Shimon Cohen. In this episode, I talk with Jordan Thierry, owner and creative director at Dream Chase Media and policy consultant. We talk about Jordan's work on the front lines of storytelling and his films, including the Black Fatherhood Project, which provides a historical and present-day context to the structural forces impacting Black families, and his new project, Grandma's Roses, which will be a series on YouTube focusing on the stories of grandmothers of color that was inspired as a tribute to his grandmother after she passed. Jordan discusses details of the stories these grandmothers shared with him about their lives and what this process was like for him. He talks about his goal of educating people and inspiring them to action. He also explains his policy work with the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. Jordan shares how he got into grassroots storytelling and social justice organizing. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hey, Jordan, thanks for coming on the podcast to talk about the excellent work you're doing on the front lines of storytelling. So just to get things started, let us know what you're up to.
Shimon, thank you, man. It's a pleasure to be on, and excited to, be a guest on this really cool podcast you got going. What am I up to? Well, about a year ago, I started my own little consulting gig called Dream Chase Media. And our thing is a focus on storytelling that involves creativity, culture, and community. And so I work with a lot of nonprofit organizations to help them kind of tell their story of impact, right? And tell the story of the people that they are working with, tell the story of the change that they're wanting to make. And then I also have my own personal projects where my passion is hearing people's stories and with permission, sharing what I hear with others in a documentary format. So I have one going right now that's focused on grandmothers.
Nice. And I should also add that you're one of the founders of this podcast, that this is a project you and I were going to do together, but it just got a little tricky coordinating everything. But got to give you props to that, and that you and I go way back. So it's real cool to see the evolution of your work over the years. And, why don't you tell us about Grandma's Roses?
The new project is called Grandma's Roses, in tribute to my grandmother, because I had lost her last year, right? And she passed really quickly. And, part of my process in, losing her and trying to understand and grasp and appreciate all of what she did in her life and what she did for me, I wanted to, talk to other grandmothers, right? And maybe part of it was just I miss my grandmother. So I wanted to see some other grandmothers. But the idea behind the project was really to hear the stories of these women, focused primarily on women of color who have, survived a lot and contributed a lot to our communities, to our society, not just their families. And my interest in particular is kind of looking at all of the labor and the love that these women put forth. And oftentimes, we sort of take our grandmothers for granted. Right? We sort of, expect them to be nurturing and kind and generous, because so many of them are. But we also, forget about so many of the sacrifices that they make. And we also sometimes forget about, all the different things that they've survived. And part of that character that, they've developed as being so reliable and strong was, out of survival, right? It was not necessarily a choice. It was out of survival because of the sort of harsh realities of systemic, racism and sexism in this country. And so that sort of undergirds my interest in these conversations with grandmothers.
So what's that process been like in terms of traveling around the country and interviewing these grandmothers?
Yeah. It's been wonderful. It's been very enlightening, humbling, emotional. I'm always surprised at the things that I hear as much as the things that I don't hear, right? I'm coming in, as a 36-year-old with a master's degree who works in policy, who works in nonprofit. So I have my own ideas about the lives that they've lived and what's significant. And then sometimes I hear something completely different. I think the thing that probably surprised me the most in these conversations, I interviewed both family and strangers. And with family and strangers, I heard a lot about the work that they've done. Like when they speak about the work that they've done, that seems to be what they've been most proud of, right? The thing that they really want to talk about is the job they had, as a teacher's aide for 40 years with the school district, or, being a foster parent to, 17 children,
Wow.
right, over the course of 45 years, or even the work that they've done, in factories and in, kind of like more hard labor type of positions. But the pride that they had in the fact that they were able to, keep those jobs for so long to put food on the table for their children, that's the stuff that they felt most proud about. The other thing that I was surprised about was the violence that they've experienced. So I know, right, that domestic violence is a huge issue. I know that sexual abuse is also a huge issue in that, it's very common, right? 1 in 3 women will experience domestic violence at some point in their lives. Well, I would say almost every single person I interviewed talked about their experience with domestic violence or sexual abuse at the hands of a loved one. And it was not a question on my protocol. It wasn't something that I asked them. It's something that kind of came up when I asked about their relationships and maybe their husband or their previous husband or previous boyfriend or what have you. And, it wasn't something that they necessarily made a point to want to bring up, but more so, oh, and this happened. And I started to dig a little more and say, well, why was that? Why was he a bad guy? Can you tell me about that? And that was the piece that really, for me, has really made me think differently about sort of what life has been like for women of my grandmother's generation and my mother's generation. So I think that's a piece that stuck with me.
Yeah, that's intense, really.
Super intense.
Yeah, and that they would open up to you, and it makes me wonder, like, how many people they ever told about that, and what kind of support was there.
Well, I will say, there were instances where some of the women I interviewed said, I haven't told anyone this, before they told me or after they told me, and said, my kids don't even know this about.
Wow.
And some of those women were strangers. And I think for me, that just speaks to how powerful and meaningful it can be to have someone ask you and want to know about your life and want to hear your story. These women are not, famous for anything. You know what I mean? They're just kind of everyday grandmothers, right? And so for them to be approached and say, I want to hear your life story and I want you to walk me through it from childhood to now and tell me your greatest, accomplishments. Tell me about, the most difficult struggles. Tell me about the happiest, moments of your life. That, I believe, has a healing aspect to it, to be able to tell your story and put it in your own words and have someone take interest in that and find meaning in your life. And I've gotten that feedback from the grandmothers as well. And so that's the piece that keeps me going and keeps me interested and fuels me to have more of these conversations. I will say though, after you have these conversations, like I try to do a few like kind of back to back, like, one Saturday, the next Sunday. It's a lot, man. Like the emotional, all that sort of energy, it sticks with me at least for a week, right? And just processing all of what I heard. So now I just try to space them out because going back to back, it just requires a lot of focus and a lot of emotional energy. But this is the work that I love to do. And I want to, continue to build up my body of work of sharing stories like these.
Yeah, so what's your plan with this project? What are you hoping these stories do, when you do release this project, and how are you releasing this project?
Yeah. So as you know, right, in the past, I made a film called the Black Fatherhood Project, and that came out in 2013, and it was a feature-length film. And I toured the country and showed it at a lot of universities and social service agencies, et cetera. And that was the kind of the original idea when I started interviewing these grandmothers, that I would kind of go about that same documentary filmmaking process. Well, that process took me 7 years. I've been working on this grandmother's project for a little over a year, and I've decided to kind of go in a different direction because I want the content to get out there sooner. So I'm actually going to be sharing these publicly on YouTube and creating a YouTube channel, Dream Chase Life. That's where all the original content is going to live. And I'll be sharing these interviews with some narration and letting these women mostly just speak for themselves, right? And so those interviews, will be out after November 15th and beyond. And then I'll also be doing some kind of complimentary content on some of the other social media channels. But for me, the power is in sharing these stories. And right now, YouTube is the best and most popular platform for videos. And so second most popular site, in the world. So that's where I want it to live. And I think it'll be great because it's also very accessible for older populations. And I thought about some other platforms, but I know that if there's, one or two websites that people in their 60s, 70s, 80s know, it's YouTube. My grandpa's on YouTube all the time. So I know that that's one where it's going to reach that demographic as well. And that's also really important to me.
We'll put in the show notes links to that site, and then look out for November 15th, and they can start seeing episodes on there.
That's right. Yep.
Perfect. So what's the goal of, I know your initial reasons for starting this project, you shared that with the connection to your grandmother, and then wanting to interview these grandmothers and share their stories. What are you hoping this experience is like for someone who's watching these videos?
I hope that they have a similar experience that I had when I met and interviewed each of these women, right? For me, I was in the same room with them, so it's a little bit different. But the things that I learned about the history of, this, where they grew up, right? I learned about the how family dynamics play out. I learned about what it means to sort of, be resilient. I learned about, what it means to sort of go through a terrible loss, right? For me, listen, a lot of this is about me. I can't if y'all get something from it, beautiful, right? I want people to get something out of it. For me, these interviews are making me a better person. These interviews are making me hopefully a better, father, a better husband. I'm not married yet, but maybe one day, right? These interviews, I think, are helping me understand historically, the experience of women in this country, and to honor that and to do better, because a lot of the problems that these women have faced have been because of men, right? And the decisions that we've made, and the harm that we've created, and the limitations that we've placed on others. And so, that's sort of the indirect impact. I'm not sure if I'm going to try to make that direct connection, because I want people to interpret these things and take away what they take away organically. But I think for men, at least, that's, I hope that would be an impact.
Right. And it seems that the format you're going to have them in on YouTube, they can be, utilized in a variety of different courses, from women and gender studies, ethnic studies, social work, psychology. It really could span quite a lot. And then whoever, educators and students can add to that conversation as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that would be an ideal, sort of use of this content. I try to make it as professional as possible, and also have the, insert the historical and social context so that people can make those connections with time and place, with these women's stories. So yeah, and the community engagement opportunities I think are infinite. And I'll probably, be doing a lot of that as well if everything goes as planned. But putting it directly out there in the hands of folks to use themselves is also, I think, the best move. With my previous project, it was a little more hands-on, and so this one I hope to open it up and let it, grow and live wherever it wants to live.
Right. So speaking of the previous project, the Black Fatherhood Project, that still is available, correct? So I know that
Absolutely.
like libraries can purchase that and have that,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be used and showings are available. And that film is a very powerful film. And it also came out of your own interest in understanding your own life, right? So, similar to your impetus for this one.
Mm-hmm.
And I was hoping you could just speak a little bit about that too, so listeners can learn about that project and possibly access it as well.
Absolutely. Shimon, that was 10 years of my life. You know what I mean? That film, that project. So the Black Fatherhood Project, I started when I was 23 years old, right? And just started graduate school and wanted something to work on over the summer. I wanted to make a documentary film. I took my, financial aid refund check, bought a camera, bought a flight to LA, got a rental car and started driving around and interviewing Black fathers. The original idea was I want to counter the stereotype of the deadbeat Black dad by interviewing and uplifting these stand-up dads, right, that I know are out there. And so I started that way. And then the more I got into it, I realized this is cool, but I'm actually kind of ignoring the elephant in the room, which is why is there this stereotype of the deadbeat Black dad?
Right.
Why is there this issue, right, in this conversation around Black fatherhood in the Black community? And yeah, statistically, it is accurate that, basically 2/3 of African American children are born to a single parent household. So what's that about? And so I shifted, right, and started making a film that explored that exact thing and trying to answer that question. And the result is this, long documentary that kind of walks the audience through the history of the Black family, kind of from Africa, coming to the United States, surviving slavery, and looking at all the different social and policy barriers that were put in place to basically disrupt and undermine the stability of the Black family. And so it's a very historical film. And then it turns to the sort of contemporary Black dads and asks them, what are your greatest challenges as a father? What's the most rewarding experience of being a father? What do you hope for your children's future? And what do we need to do to address some of these issues of family in the Black community? And so, I'm incredibly proud of my work on that film. I think it still stands up to, today.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's accessible, and we've shown it, all over, right? And a lot of universities have purchased it, and social work programs especially. And so, yeah, it is available. It's on the platform Canopy, which a lot of universities, libraries use this platform called Canopy with a K. So it can be watched on there, and then it can also be accessed on blackfatherhoodproject.com.
I think it's so interesting that you started out wanting to focus on one aspect of, dismantling this stereotype, right? And then there's no way to do that without getting into the historical context and really how things came to be, right?
Right. Yeah.
And whenever we start looking at how things came to be, policy always comes up.
Has to.
Because as you well know, many, many policies have been put into place specifically targeting the African American community.
Mm-hmm.
Targeting, I mean, in a detrimental way.
Yeah.
Right? Like the racial wealth gap would not exist today without numerous policies.
Mm-hmm. So many.
So I'm interested in the connection between your storytelling and filmmaking, and also your policy work, because you've done a lot of policy work over the years and you're still doing policy work. So could you also talk about that?
Sure. I sort of started to dip my toe in that work when I started doing civic engagement, voting rights work at the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation way back in 2006, and was leading a program for young Black voters called Black Youth Vote. And that's when I started to really get involved and pay more attention to politics, and then had the opportunity to work with philanthropic groups around voting rights issue, democracy issues, census and redistricting, and learning all about that stuff, and helping foundations figure out where to put their money when it comes to investing in improving our democracy and fighting voter disenfranchisement. And so most recently, I had the great honor and privilege of working at PolicyLink with the founder, Angela Glover Blackwell, and my close colleague, Mark Philpart, with a special initiative called the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. And that's where I really got to do more hands-on direct lobbying on policy as it relates to education issues, workforce development, and intimate partner violence. And so, like you said, if folks aren't talking about policy when they talk about the problems in this country and history of this country, then they're not really having a real conversation, right? Because policy undergirds all this stuff. As far as I see it. And the work that I was able to be a part of was really supporting grassroots community organizations that are working with young people to be the leaders of change in their communities. And it was sort of my role to help connect them to the opportunities, support their work to change policy, right? And so a lot of stuff I was involved in was around the school to prison pipeline and trying to eliminate suspensions and expulsions for ridiculous reasons, and things that kids are getting kicked out of school for misbehaviors or not abiding by the dress code or by challenging their teacher under the category of what they call willful defiance. So that gave me an opportunity to really see how much policy plays, the role that policy plays in everything that we do, and also like the process, right? And it's a complicated process, but it's also, at least in California and at the state level, incredibly accessible. It's really not that difficult to get in those halls of power and have conversations with your legislators and influence their decisions, right? And to put forth ideas that work. And so, I worked there and did that work for 3 years, and still I'm doing some work with them as a consultant. And it's the most powerful work I've ever been a part of. And I learned, so much in that process. And it's just unfortunate that people feel like policy is so inaccessible. It feels like kind of a distant, foggy thing for most people, and they did for me for a long time, but it really isn't.
Yeah, I think that's going to have to be a future episode of really breaking down that process so that people can feel like they have the skills. Because I think that is often the real barrier, one of the many, because there's a whole access issue, obviously,
Right.
as well.
Of course.
But it's really just like not even knowing how to get started, is what I think a lot of it is, that like these people are just bigger than the rest of us, and therefore they're untouchable.
Right. Yeah, no, that's right. And I think that, universities could be doing a much better job of teaching people, students, about policy and about the policy process, because it relates to every single, industry and field that there is out there. And the people who are doing the work should have a voice in that policy that's being made that's impacting their work.
I agree 100%. I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about just your background and how you got into all of this.
Yeah.
Because I think, you shared a little bit about why you started both of these film projects.
Sure.
But you didn't really give the part before that, about you and how that even came to be. So maybe you could share a little bit about that.
Absolutely, man. Thank you for asking. I was wondering when you were going to ask.
What's your story?
Man, to give, in a nutshell, I'm a multiracial, Black kid that grew up in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. So you can imagine what that was like in the 80s and 90s, where I was one of only a handful of African American kids in my school, and always noticing the difference, always having the difference being pointed out to me, right? And I was a sociable person and I got along with people really well, but it created this hunger in me to, be more connected to African American community and issues and culture. And it also created, I think, for me, sort of a way of looking at the world where, for me, it's always about kind of understanding difference, and also there's an internal sort of desire to reconcile difference, through understanding, because I saw it in my own family, very different worlds. And I always felt like the bridge between that. And so, as I got into my career, social change work was the work that I wanted to do. But I spent my summers, watching 3-4 videos, films a day. You could go down to the corner store. This is down in Illinois where I spent my summers, and get rent 3 movies for $1. And so we did that every single day. And I was, pretty much always just watching, whatever Black movies there were, right? From old Blaxploitation films to the Boys in the Hood and the Spike Lee joints.
We know you were watching Hollywood Shuffle.
And I was watching Hollywood Shuffle. Tommy! And so for me, it was like my connection beyond my immediate family with Black stories and Black life was through cinema, right? And so I had this incredible interest in storytelling and cinema. And when I got to college, I got an opportunity to kind of, dip my toe in multimedia, and I fell in love with it. And I watched a documentary film called Life in Debt, which is about national debt in Jamaica and what the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank did to kind of restrict Jamaica's growth, right? And so that was like the film that made me want to do documentary films. And I went to University of Oregon, and they had a documentary film track. And so, my passion and interest was and is in telling stories of people of color and Black people in particular. And so that's how I set about making that first, feature-length film on Black fatherhood. And it's been, why I'm still pushing, trying to tell these stories today and having fun.
Yeah, man, I love it. I love hearing that story. And it's crazy that I've known you all these years and never knew that about that film that inspired you.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we met at University of Oregon,
Mm-hmm.
I think in the Multicultural Center.
Yeah.
Is where we first met. Been rapping ever since.
Right. And that's, that was, I should just, give a shout out to the Multicultural Center, to Steve Morzumi, to, all the homies there, because that's where I learned about organizing, right? And that's where I started to get involved in social justice is at the University of Oregon with you and our homies from that time period. And that was, super impactful. As short of a time period as it was, like for me, 2 years, it feels like it was such a huge part of my life still,
Yeah, and very transformative years.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as we're getting towards the end here, I want to ask you what listeners can do to support your work, get involved in your work. Of course, we'll post the link to the YouTube channel, but is there anything else you want to put out there and you want to share while you got the mic?
Subscribe to the Doing the Work podcast. That's what you got to do. Throwing it right back on you. And yeah, no, you can check out the Black Fatherhood Project at blackfatherproject.com. And yeah, I'm on Instagram, jordan.theory, and holler at me.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on here and sharing your story with us and talking about the work you're doing. And thanks for doing the work. This is a bit of a different episode than some of my other interviews. And I think it's really important because the work you're doing is so critically important. And you are out there on the front lines. You're going into people's homes, providing a space for them to open up, to tell these powerful stories that then can be shared where people can learn, based on other people's experiences. So I'm real appreciative. And I think this was pretty cool. And I hope people appreciate this conversation.
Thanks, Shimon. I appreciate you having me on, man. And, I'm proud of the work that you're doing with the podcast. I'm really excited. I'm trying to follow your lead, man.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. Thank you for listening to Doing the Work, Frontline Stories of Social Change. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please follow on Twitter and leave positive reviews on iTunes. If you're interested in being a guest or know someone who's doing great work, please get in touch. And thank you for doing real work to make this world a better place.